Hello there, Michelle Short here for My Favourite Things. Today I have an Oceans of Fun scene card to share with you. So let's get started. This is the adorable Oceans of Fun stamp set. I love all of the different critters in this, but I am going to use the narwhal, the little fish, the starfish and one of the sentiments. So I've stamped the images onto some smooth white cardstock using extreme black ink, and I'm going to colour them with Copic markers. So I'm starting off with the starfish here and mapping out my darkest areas. This is the YR27 and I'm focusing most of the darker colour towards the bottom of the images and fading it up to lighter at the top. I'm then blending that out with the YR24. I'm then going in with the Y17. This is a little bit too orange, but I go back in with the Y08 and really blend that out. Did take me a little while to blend all of those colours together, but I did get there in the end. And then I can finish off with the Y13. For the little fish, I did actually stamp them upside down. I didn't feel that it made a difference whether they were facing the left or the right in terms of how they looked. Hopefully that is the case. I'm colouring those with some purple markers, my go-to purple marker shades, which is V17, V15 and V12. The reason I stamped those upside down was so that I could have some elements sort of facing towards the left and some elements facing towards the right. I found that it would balance out the cards a little bit better. I did accidentally go outside of the lines here because these fish are absolutely tiny, so I'm just using the Copic Colourless blender to push that colour back in, and it did work really quite well. I find that if I accidentally go over the lines with Copic markers, you can kind of rectify that quite easily with the Colourless blender, but I'm going to show you in a minute how I used it in the wrong way. So for the narwhal, I'm going to colour him with some teal shades. So I'm starting off with my darkest shade here, which is the BG49, and I'm adding that colour towards the bottom of the narwhal. I'm then going to go in with BG15. Now ordinarily this colour combination works really well for me, but for some reason today it just was not happening. So I'm working really hard here to try and blend these colours together. I'm then going in with the BG13 and again working really hard to try and blend those together. I'm then going to go in with the BG11. I go back in with the BG13 because that was just not blending well, back in with the BG11, and then I can finish off with the BG10 at the top. And you can see here that as I'm colouring this in, it has bled significantly on the left hand side outside of the stamped lines, and it has bled a little bit on the right hand side as well. Now I should have just left this as is and figured out a way to cover it a little bit later, which is what I'm going to do. And ordinarily when ink bleeds outside of the lines, sometimes if it's not too bad you can push it back in with the colourless blender like I did with the fish, but sometimes it just makes it a lot worse, and in this case it just made it a lot worse. But I'm trying my best here to see if I can really push that colour back in. The problem is sometimes when ink has bled, the reason it's bled is because I've added so many layers of wet ink into that cardstock that it's just absorbing into the cardstock and pushing the colour out. So if I had added some layers, figured out that it wasn't blending very well, left it to dry and then went back in, it wouldn't have bled. But like I said, I'm trying to rectify it slightly with this colourless blender. The problem is sometimes when you add the colourless blender on top, it wettens that ink again and then pushes the colour even further back out. So I went in with an electric fan, a handheld fan, to see if I could dry that a little bit quicker so that it didn't do that. Unfortunately, like I said, it made it a lot worse, and even still I'm going back in to try it again and it's just making it worse. So you know, you learn from your mistakes, don't you? This is just what happens sometimes with card making. So for the horn here, I am using some pink shades. So I used RV55 and RV52. And I learned my lesson, and I'm just leaving this as is, and I'm going to try and rectify that bleeding a little bit later. So next I'm taking the Coordinating Oceans of Fun Dynamics, placing the dies on top of the images. I'm going to hold them down with some low tack tape and run that through my die cutting machine. For the background, I've taken a panel of white cardstock that's cut to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and I'm going to add some ink blending on top for an ocean look. So I'm starting off with my darkest shade of Distress ink, and this is Prize Ribbon. I'm using an ink blending brush, and I'm blending that colour towards the bottom of this panel. I find it easier to ink blend from the right hand side, although technically I'm ambidextrous. I for some reason always gravitate towards ink blending with my right hand, so it's easier for me to turn the panel on its side. I'm then going in with Mermaid Lagoon Distress ink and blending that towards the top. This did take me quite a lot of layers to get kind of like a smooth blend. I didn't quite get there in the end. I'm not sure why, but it was just one of those days. It doesn't really matter too much because I am going to add a few extra things on top, and I don't think you notice it too much in the end. So I'm just trying to get a smoother blend as possible with these inks, focusing the darker colour towards the bottom. I'm then taking the Sunny Rays stencil, and I want to add some light rays that would be kind of through the water. So I'm placing that stencil towards the top of the panel, holding that down with some post-it tape, and then I'm taking some white pigment ink on a foam ink blending tool, and I'm going to add that ink in between these stencil pieces to create those light rays. I want them to be a little bit lighter towards the top and sort of fade out a little bit towards the bottom, the further down in the ocean that you get. I don't want to add that foam ink blending tool back into my ink pad because it has got a little bit of blue ink on it now, because the white pigment ink has reacted with that distress ink underneath. So I'm just going to pounce some more of that white pigment ink on a non-stick craft sheet and then pick that up with the blending tool. I didn't want these light rays to be kind of too in your face, but in hindsight I probably could have gone a little bit bolder with them. So I'm just blending that colour on, and then I can remove that stencil. Next I've got the Under the Sea Dynamics, and this is a really fun set because you can use it to create lots of different scenes. I have cut some of the layers out, so I've got like the cave type piece, some seaweed or coral, and the floor kind of seabed as well. So I'm taking this kind of, it looks a little bit like a cave. You could use it as a cave or maybe like a little arch or something, and ordinarily this would probably be like a sandy colour or maybe like a grey, but I wanted to create it more like a silhouette, so I'm using the same colours of distress ink that I use for the background. So I'm taking Prize Ribbon distress ink first and adding quite a lot of that onto this die cut here. I have cut it from white cardstock. And then I'm adding Mermaid Lagoon at the top, just where those light rays would reach this piece here at the bottom of the ocean. I've cut it twice from white cardstock, and I want to get rid of the white core of this piece. I'm using this really just as a layer in between so that this piece can be popped up a little bit from the background, but I don't want that white core of the cardstock to show because the rest of it is all ink blended. I've then cut some coral, so the pink piece is cut from ripe raspberry cardstock, and I'm adding a little bit of picked raspberry distress ink towards the bottom. And then I've cut this piece from grapesicle cardstock and using wilted violet distress ink to add the darker colour towards the bottom. I've then got this green piece here. This is sour apple cardstock, and I'm adding a little bit of rustic wilderness distress ink towards the bottom. I'm going to cut the seaweed from this. I thought that it would be easier for me to add the ink blending onto this piece and then do the die cutting rather than try and add ink blending onto tiny little die cuts. I've then got the ocean floor piece here that I've cut from some ivory cardstock, and I'm using vintage photo distress ink to add a little bit of colour towards the bottom of this piece. Again, focusing most of the colour towards the bottom. I'm then taking some On Point Precision Glue, adding that on the bottom layer of this. I don't know whether, I don't know if it's necessarily a cave piece because I'm doing it so that you can actually see the light rays through it. So I'm kind of making it more of like an arch. So I'm adhering those two pieces together. I don't want to get any fingerprints into the ink, so I'm just pressing that down from the back, and then I can add some more glue onto the back of this before I adhere that down onto the panel. So just pressing that down, and then I want to add a little bit more interest onto this panel and make it look like it definitely is in water. So I'm taking some water on a brush and I'm splattering that onto the panel, and that water is going to react with the distress inks and make some kind of water splotches. So I am adding quite a bit of that, and then I'm going to set that aside to dry. And now I can die cut those seaweed pieces from this panel of cardstock. I'm adding some thin foam tape towards the bottom of the panel, and then I can add the kind of seabed on top. So we can just remove the backing off of that foam tape, and then I can place that down on top. And then I can cut the excess from either side with some scissors. I've just adhered that down towards the bottom so that when I add in this coral here, I can kind of lift up the top and it's going to fit underneath quite nicely. And I'm just sticking them down with some On Point Precision Glue. So I've got the coral there on the right hand side, and then I'm adding this seaweed here on the left hand side. And because I'm using the liquid glue and it hasn't dried yet, I can lift up that piece of seaweed. I wanted it to be a little bit taller. So just using the tweezers there just to pop it up a little bit higher. I've then added some thin foam tape onto the back of this panel, and I'm adhering it down onto an A2 size white card base. So that's a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. I'm then stamping the sentiment from the Oceans of Fun stamp set onto some black licorice cardstock using Versamark ink. I can apply some white detail embossing powder. I do like to add this a couple of times, tap off the excess to make sure that I get a really nice coverage of that powder. I'm then going to heat set that and cut that into a strip. I've added some thin foam tape onto the back of that, and then I can place that down onto the card. And I'm using a T-square ruler here just to help me try and line that up straight. So once I'm happy, I can press that down. I've then added some thin foam tape onto the back of the starfish, and I'm adding him down here in the bottom left hand corner. And then here I'm going in with a white gel pen. This is a Jelly Roll 0.8 pen, and I'm using that to kind of paint that outside edge of the narwhal where I bled over the lines, and it did end up covering it quite nicely. I did go in with a couple of layers. I let it dry and then went back in with another layer, and as you can see here, it's pretty much covered that up. So I've added some thin foam tape onto the back of him, and then I can pop him down onto the card. I've then added some On Point Precision Glue onto the fish, and then I can pop those in place. I'm then taking an E33 Copic marker, and I'm adding some dots onto the bottom of the ocean here. I'm kind of thinking it kind of looks a little bit like sand, I suppose. I'm not sure if that's what you get in the bottom of the ocean. Probably more on a beach, but I still think it looks quite nice. So I'm just adding a few dots there to add a little bit of texture. And then I can finish off by bringing in that white gel pen again, and I'm just going to add some dots onto the coral and the seaweed. And I'm just adding generally 3 dots in a row. A couple of on this pink piece here, I did end up adding 2 or 1 just because it's such a tiny little area. And this is just going to add a little bit of extra detail onto the card. And so that is the card finished for today. I really like how it turned out. You could definitely go all out with a lovely ocean look with lots of different characters in this, but I do just like having the focus mainly on that narwhal. Links to the products that I used will be listed in the description bar here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.